He's lived alone for 12 years, pays his bills on time, fixes things when they break, never misses work. And if you asked him right now, sitting in that quiet house at 10 p.m., whether he's happy, he'd pause just a little too long before answering. What you're about to hear isn't about loneliness the way movies show it. No man crying into a bowl of cereal. This is about something quieter and harder to name. The gap between a life that looks complete and a man who genuinely can't tell if it is. By the end, you'll understand why independence and isolation can feel identical from the inside, and why that confusion is the most dangerous part. Here's a question to sit with for 5 seconds. When was the last time you called a friend for no reason at all, no news, no favor, no crisis, just to talk? Hold that answer. We're coming back to it. The man who lives alone doesn't complain, not because everything's fine, because complaining requires an audience, and he stopped expecting one a long time ago. This is the first thing people get wrong about him. They assume silence means satisfaction. It doesn't. Silence for a lot of these men is just the default setting, the emotional thermostat they set so low in their 20s that they forgot it could go higher. Here's a number worth sitting with. The Signia Loneliness in America report from 2025 found that 60% of Gen X adults qualify as lonely, not sad, not depressed, lonely, which is a different animal entirely. And these aren't men who look like they're struggling. They have jobs, cars, routines, a fridge that's stocked. From the outside, the life looks assembled, functional, even enviable. The consequence for the man living it is this: because nothing looks broken, nothing gets fixed. He doesn't reach out because he doesn't have a concrete reason to, and the people around him don't check in because he seems fine. The most invisible crisis looks exactly like a life well managed. This week, notice how many times you reframe a feeling into a task. Turned "I miss people" into "I should clean the garage." That reframe is worth catching. Picture a Tuesday morning. He's up at 6:30 without an alarm that stopped being necessary years ago. Coffee's made, phone's checked. A group chat from guys he's known since 1994 has 3 unread messages, all of them memes. He sends a thumbs up and puts the phone face down. It's not until he's driving to work, or to the hardware store, or wherever Tuesday takes him, that the thought surfaces. The last real conversation he had was Sunday. Not a long one, just his neighbor complaining about the HOA. 2 days of silence, and he didn't notice until mile 4 on the highway. A 2026 AARP study on Gen X men and friendship found that men are far less likely than women to reach out without a specific reason. No birthday, no emergency, no logistics, no call. The friendship is real. The affection is real. But the wire between them goes quiet for weeks, sometimes months, and both men on each end of that wire call it normal. Normal and healthy are not the same address. The real-world consequence is slow and easy to miss. The longer the gap between real conversations, the harder it becomes to start one. Silence compounds like debt. This week's action is small but specific. Text one person something that isn't a meme, a link, or a logistical question. One sentence about something actual. That's the whole move. Here's something that doesn't get said enough. The Gen X man who lives alone didn't become self-sufficient at 45. He became self-sufficient at 9. Latchkey kid, mom working doubles, dad either gone or present in body only. You figured out dinner, you figured out homework, you figured out that asking for help produced either nothing or irritation, so you stopped asking. That wiring didn't expire when he turned 30. It runs underneath everything he does now. The way he handles a medical scare alone, the way he processes a bad week by going quiet instead of calling someone, the way he genuinely believes that needing people is a design flaw rather than a feature. Research on adverse childhood experiences, tracked extensively by the CDC across multiple studies through 2023, consistently links early emotional self-reliance with higher rates of social withdrawal in midlife men. The men who learned earliest to need the least are the ones most likely, decades later, to live in a house where no one knows their Wi-Fi password. The consequence isn't dramatic. There's no breakdown. There's just a man who is extraordinarily competent and quietly unreachable. He didn't choose isolation, he was trained for it. The actionable step this week: identify one thing you're currently handling alone that you could, not could, mention to another person. You don't have to hand it over, just say it out loud to someone. That's the first crack in the wall. Two men, same age, 53, same city, both living alone in a two-bedroom apartment with a good coffee maker and a truck that's paid off. From the outside, identical. From the inside, entirely different countries. The first man never married. Not from fear, not from a wound. He just didn't. His 20s were about building. His 30s were relationships that ran long but never tipped into a wedding. By the time his mid-40s arrived, solo living wasn't a gap in his life, it was the architecture. He's been managing his own schedule, his own silence, his own social calendar since before most people figure out who they are. He's not performing peace, he actually built it. The second man was married for 14 years. The divorce wasn't war, it was erosion. And when it ended, he didn't just lose a partner, he lost the person who remembered his college roommate's name, who texted back his sister on his behalf, who kept the social world running while he focused on work. A study published in the Journal of Health and Social Behavior found that men are significantly more likely than women to rely on a spouse as their sole source of emotional support. In some samples, more than 60% of married men named their wife as their only confidant. When that one relationship ends, the entire support structure collapses at once. He didn't lose a wife. He lost his entire social infrastructure. If you're the second man, the move isn't to replace what you lost immediately. It's to rebuild one connection at a time deliberately before you need it. Here's a question worth sitting with longer than 5 seconds. What if the guy who says he prefers being alone isn't describing his personality, he's describing his history? The word introvert gets used a lot around men like this. He doesn't go to parties. He leaves early when he does. He recharges alone. Introvert, case closed. Except personality research doesn't work that cleanly. Susan Cain's work in Quiet, drawing on decades of personality psychology, makes a distinction that matters here. There's a difference between a man who is genuinely energized by solitude and a man who learned that solitude was safer than connection. One is temperament, the other is adaptation, and from the outside, and sometimes from the inside, they look exactly the same. The 2026 AARP study on Gen X men found that 95% of men said close friendships are essential to a happy, healthy life. 95%. That is not the number of a generation that doesn't want connection. That's the number of a generation that wants it and doesn't know how to maintain it, or quietly decided somewhere along the way that wanting it was a vulnerability they couldn't afford. Preferring solitude and fearing connection are not the same thing. This week, ask yourself honestly, when you turn down a social invitation, is it because you genuinely want to be alone, or because showing up feels like more risk than reward? The answer matters. Write it down if you have to. If this is landing somewhere real for you, if you recognize this man or recognize yourself as him, subscribe before we go further. The next 5 blocks are where it gets harder and more useful: friendships running on fumes, a medical scare with no one in the waiting room, and the one shift that actually changes something. Don't stop at halftime. There's a man, call him David, 52 years old, lives outside Columbus, Ohio. Last year he got a diagnosis, nothing immediately fatal but serious enough to require surgery and a recovery period that meant he couldn't drive for 3 weeks. He had to call someone, not text. Actually call and ask for help getting to appointments. He went through his contacts and realized he had exactly one person he could ask without it feeling strange. One. Not because he was unpopular. He'd known this friend since 1991, 33 years. But in those 33 years, the friendship had lived almost entirely in a group chat and an annual fishing trip. His friend didn't know about the diagnosis because David hadn't told him, hadn't told anyone. He handled the first 2 months of test results completely alone because that's what handling things looked like to him. The AARP 2026 friendship study found that men's friendships, while often long-lasting, are significantly lower in emotional disclosure than women's friendships. Men rate their closest friendships as high in enjoyment but low in vulnerability. Long history, thin rope, 30 years of friendship, still alone in the waiting room. The action here is uncomfortable but simple. Tell one person in your life something true about what's actually going on with you. Not a complaint, just a fact. I've been dealing with something. That sentence opens a door that logistics never will. Here's something researchers keep finding and men keep ignoring. The friendship doesn't end, it just goes silent. And silence, held long enough, is its own kind of ending. The AARP 2026 study described male friendships as high passion, low vulnerability. Men will spend 4 hours debating the greatest running back of all time with genuine intensity. They will not spend 4 minutes saying something is wrong. The researchers used a phrase that sticks. Men connect shoulder to shoulder, doing things side by side, while women connect face to face in direct conversation. Neither style is wrong, but shoulder to shoulder connection requires proximity. It requires a shared activity, a physical space, a reason to be in the same place. When life spreads people across cities and time zones, that style of connection loses its infrastructure before the men involved even notice. A 2023 Survey Center on American Life report found that 15% of men reported having no close friends at all, up from just 3% in 1990. That's not men deciding friendship doesn't matter. That's men losing the conditions that made friendship easy and not knowing how to rebuild it under new ones. The wire doesn't snap, it just slowly stops carrying anything. Rebuilding doesn't require a deep conversation, it requires repetition. Same person, multiple low-stakes contacts over time, that's how the wire comes back. Start with one message this week that has nothing to do with logistics. Picture the moment. He's sitting in a parking lot outside a medical building. The appointment took 40 minutes. The doctor used careful language, the kind of careful that means something is actually wrong. He has a follow-up scheduled for Thursday. He sits in the driver's seat for a few minutes before starting the engine. There is no one to call. Not because people don't exist in his life, but because calling someone with this information means admitting the information is real. It means accepting that the situation is serious enough to require another person. And somewhere in the architecture of how he was built, that threshold is set extraordinarily high. So he drives home, makes dinner, watches something on television, handles it. Unmarried men between 40 and 60 are 3.5 times more likely to die by suicide than married men in the same age range, according to research cited across multiple public health studies through 2023. Divorced men specifically run 8 times the risk of divorced women. The researchers point to the same mechanism every time. Men who live alone often have no one functioning as what psychologists call a health monitor, someone who notices changes, asks questions, pushes back when something seems off. The absence of that person isn't just emotional, it's physiological. It shows up in outcomes. Nobody monitoring means nobody catching what you miss about yourself. This week, schedule one medical appointment you've been postponing, not for anyone else, because the parking lot moment is harder alone than it needs to be, and earlier is always better than later. Here's what makes this generation specifically hard to read. Gen X men were handed a particular aesthetic of competence and told it was character. Handle your business, don't make it someone else's problem. Look like you've got it together even when you don't, especially when you don't. So the loneliness, when it arrives, doesn't arrive wearing the face people expect. It doesn't look like a man who can't get out of bed. It looks like a man with a clean house and a full calendar and a set of optimized systems for living alone efficiently. It looks like someone who has strong opinions about coffee and knows exactly how he likes his weekends structured. From the outside, and often from the inside, it reads as preference, as personality, as a man who simply doesn't need much. The 2025 Cigna Loneliness Report found that 60% of Gen X adults qualify as lonely, higher than baby boomers, higher than millennials, And adults between 45 and 59 specifically report the highest rates, with 46% saying they feel lonely now. These aren't men who look like they're struggling. They look busy, independent, fine. Loneliness with good time management is still loneliness. Stop using productivity as evidence that you're okay. A full schedule and a full life are not the same thing. Notice the difference this week. Not to fix it immediately, just to see it clearly. Breaking the silence doesn't look like a dramatic confession. It doesn't require a therapist's couch or a heart-to-heart that runs 3 hours. For the Gen X man who lives alone, the shift is almost always smaller than he expected and more significant than he anticipated. What changes first isn't the loneliness, it's the weight of managing the performance. Because living alone and appearing completely fine about it requires constant low-level maintenance. Multiplied across years, it becomes exhausting in a way that's hard to name because it never produces a single dramatic moment. Just a slow accumulation of distance between who he is and what he shows. A 2024 study published in the American Journal of Men's Health found that men who increased their frequency of meaningful social contact, defined as at least one honest, non-transactional conversation per week, reported measurable reductions in perceived stress within 8 weeks. 8 weeks, not a year of therapy, not a life overhaul. One real conversation per week for 2 months. The door doesn't need to open wide, just crack it. The forward-looking reality is this: by 2030, the oldest Gen X men will be pushing 65. The research on social connection and health outcomes at that age is unambiguous. Isolated men face significantly higher risks of cognitive decline, cardiovascular disease, and early mortality. The window for rebuilding connection is open now, and it is not permanently open. Start this week with one honest exchange, not a performance, a real one. Here's what all of this adds up to. The Gen X man who lives alone isn't broken. He's built, assembled carefully from self-reliance, silence, and a specific era that told him needing people was weakness. That building held. It got him here. But a structure built for one can become its own kind of trap, and the difference between freedom and isolation is not the square footage. It's whether anyone actually knows you're in there. The question worth carrying out of this video isn't, am I lonely? It's simpler and harder than that. Does anyone know what's actually going on with you right now? If the answer takes more than 2 seconds, that's the answer.